I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It's called the ACEs study for short. And if you haven't heard of it, really what it is a 10,000 people, Kaiser Permanente and the CDC looked at 10,000 people and did a little survey. And it's really all they did. They asked them a bunch of questions, just about their childhood. And there was sort of 10 events that they highlighted that were major events that they could think of, things like divorce, right? Or having a parent incarcerated, mental or emotional, physical abuse, sexual abuse, these type of things. And there was 10 of them. And these are very sort of high level traumas or experiences. And of these experiences, when people noted that they had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, the more experiences that they noted, the more they recognized that these adults had health challenges in their life. So this was very interesting, right? And it's hard to draw a direct correlation between something that happened. Let's say you were physically abused at 4 years old. How do we draw a direct correlation between that and getting diabetes when you're 42, right? Or heart disease at 51. But we noticed that was the case. The more adverse childhood experiences, the more likelihood that somebody was to experience higher levels of disease. And now there's a couple explanations here, and I don't think that they're separate or inconsistent. One explanation is that the more things that happen to us in childhood, the more likely we are to perhaps drink alcohol on a regular basis or in excess, to smoke, to do illicit drugs, to have behavioral patterns that we know are unhealthy, right? Like that's a very easy assumption to make, that the more that was the case, then the more likely we're going to behave in a certain way. And there's these notable things from a lifestyle perspective that we can think of that we know are bad for our health. But there's other things that we don't think of that aren't traditionally good for our health either. And one of the things that we can look to is sort of this idea of the perfectionist, or somebody that is so hardworking. Like think about like a Steve Jobs, for example, right? Extremely brilliant mind, but he got cancer at an early age. He was notorious for being sort of a hard ass and really criticizing people that he worked with. So that the things in his childhood can create these patterns as we get older that are also detrimental, but we don't think of as detrimental because we reward them in our society. So these things create behavioral patterns that, like I said, may or may not be healthy, and some of them are easy to identify. But the other thing that these childhood experiences really do is they affect our whole system, right? They affect the way our nervous system behaves. They affect really our entire body, our entire mind, and our entire belief system. So these childhood events can really form our personalities. They form these character structures of who we become. And that, in turn, in the long run, will affect various parts of the body or disease processes in the body. So there's sort of 2 main categories that we can think of. And I believe they're both accurate. They're both happening. One is a more subtle level of effect, and one is a more gross level of effect. But what we notice is that as we get into like 6 and 7 ACEs, which is not that uncommon, we start to see very, very high levels of issues. Things like with 0 ACEs, so from 0 to 10, 0 ACEs, about 33% of American adults report 0 ACEs, right? And this is only a 10 questionnaire example. From about 51% of the population reports from 1 to 3 ACEs. And about 16% of the population reports 4 to 8 ACEs. So again, these are just a very select number of ACEs, of adverse childhood events. But when we get up to 1 to 3 ACEs, we see that 1 in 9 are alcoholic, 1 in 43 uses IV drugs, and 1 in 7 has heart disease. That's double from somebody who reports no ACEs, right? So this is a massive impact. And so there's a lot of research actually on a lot of levels to determine what's really happening here. Either way, we know that this is a strong correlation to pay attention to, and we're starting to learn. I shouldn't say we've been learning for quite some time the mechanisms that this is really undertaking when it comes to how these are affecting our physical health and our mental health. So really, we need to recognize that it's not just the bottom line number that says 1 in 96 attempt suicide with no ACEs and 1 in 10 attempt suicide with 1 to 3 ACEs. These are obvious things, these suicides and the drug abuse, and it's obvious. What about the heart disease? What about the autoimmune conditions? What about the chronic fatigue syndrome, right? These things are very relevant when it comes to these childhood events and these traumas that we experience. Now, the one thing I really want to highlight here is the ACEs study was fantastic because it gave us something solid, something concrete to look at, gave us a good example of what to pay attention to. But again, that was only 10 questions. Clearly, there are more than 10 things that can happen to us in childhood or even early adulthood that would be traumatic, right? So losing somebody in a car accident, or these as little micro traumas, right? That perhaps you were told something often enough when you were a child that created a belief system. Perhaps there was just a disappointment, a recurring disappointment from your caregivers that was so minor. But when you're a child, when you're so little and you don't have a lot of resource, you don't have the emotional intelligence to understand what's happening, all you know is what you're experiencing, which is pain. And so these things can happen on a micro level, these little micro traumas. And as they build and create belief systems and create patterns, then that can take hold as well. And they can act just like these major traumas that they interviewed people about. So it's not just the ACEs, it's also a lot more of these big traumas. And we have a ton of little micro traumas that are actually often very hard to identify.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily something you can pinpoint so easily.
Yeah, on the subject of microtraumas that are hard to identify, there's one that I'm aware of because I know some people who this is the case for. It's very counterintuitive, and most people would not even think of it in the same sense of like a serious trauma. But if you are held to the standard of perfection throughout your childhood and you're constantly told how perfect you are and great you are in every way, and then at some point you don't meet that standard of perfection, you maybe get poor grades in a class, you fail a class or something, or you do poorly in a sport, or you are embarrassed because you said or did something that was kind of dumb. You now have, and then everybody's so shocked that you've completely, not held up to the standard of perfection. A seemingly minor thing that for maybe most people might be a very small thing, all of a sudden becomes this major trauma because you are now finding out for the first time that, and other people around you are finding out that you're not perfect.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And this is, you're hitting it right on the head. And one I like to really highlight is the reward system that we often see in our culture. Right? When somebody does something good, we give them praise. When they do something bad, we either don't give them praise or we criticize or judge, right? And again, as parents, we do the best we can, and as school teachers, and we're doing the best we can, but sometimes without that awareness, these little things that we don't think are a big deal may end up creating patterns in a child who is still learning to adapt to the environment. So if a parent is really praising the child for doing really good things and they get harshly criticized or they get no love essentially for maybe doing okay, they got 5th place in whatever, or they get criticized by the hard father, so to speak, right? Or when they get 1st place, they get really, really strongly rewarded. What you're doing is you're creating this pattern that says to the child subconsciously, we love you when you do really well. But when you don't do well, we don't really love you. And there's something wrong with you and you need to do better. Now, of course, we're not saying this overtly, but subconsciously and emotionally, that's often the impact. And so, and this is more common than we think. I sort of grew up in this paradigm where I learned that I would get more love if I did things really well. So I became sort of a perfectionist. I learned to excel at certain things because that's when I would get more love. I would feel accepted and loved for who I am. If I failed or I didn't participate or whatever it was, there was a perception in my child mind that said, I'm not getting love. I'm not getting accepted at that stage for who I am. So this is very, very strong patterning that can take hold.